Recorded like 10 minutes and I realized the mic was off, so let's rewind. Here we go. Hi everyone, welcome to Hubtown podcast number 2 from 2.0. With the money we made from our first illustrious podcast, we've upgraded our set tenfold, so I hope everybody appreciates that. Today we're going to branch off of our previous conversation, which was about CrossFit programming, and settle into Olympic weightlifting programming. For those of you that are CrossFit athletes exclusively, you may feel as though this conversation doesn't necessarily apply to you. I hope you find some things in the conversation that you think are interesting, and at least you can see that there is a difference between what happens in the Olympic weightlifting section and in the CrossFit section, particularly and almost exclusively in how we deal with the Olympic weightlifting movements to snatch and clean and jerk. Amanda she doesn't want to talk about her credentials, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows that this girl knows what she's talking about. Amanda's the head coach of our Olympic weightlifting club, the Hubtown Weightlifting Club. It's seen a lot of successes in the last couple of years. We have the junior silver medalist. Thea is a senior national qualifier, so this will be her first year at senior nationals. We also have Masters, Worlds, and Pan Am gold medalists and silver medalists. This girl knows what she's talking about. She's also an NCCP Comp Dev coach, which is the national requirement. Did I do it right?
You did it.
Which is the national requirement for coaching standards. So, just so you know that she has a lot of background in this, she takes it tremendously seriously, and her athletes and clubs have seen success because of it. So that's the most I'll carry on about Amanda. Thea, conversely, is a national level Olympic weightlifter. We hope to pick both of their brains today, respectively, about what their views are on Olympic weightlifting, how programming differs, how it's different from CrossFit, and and we'll just sort of settle in from there. Is that cool? I'll act as the moderator today, so hashtag team Chris Tufts is out, and hashtag Thea and Amanda is in. Okay, so to start, Amanda, I'm coming hot at you. CrossFit versus Olympic weightlifting programming. Sorry, let me phrase that so I'm not reading from a book. How do you think CrossFit programming, what are the mainstay differences between CrossFit programming and Olympic weightlifting programming? How would you see them as different from one another?
So I think the biggest difference that our clients would perceive, or our members would perceive, would be that anytime that you're training for any sport, you're really specifically trying to get better at that sport. In CrossFit, we pride ourselves on being able to be better at many different things. So gymnastics and improving our cardio and overall strength, and those things are very broad, but when we're looking to develop athletes that can compete and succeed at high performance, it really becomes a lot more specific as far as what we're trying to accomplish.
When you start an athlete from the beginning, what are the high points that you want to hit, and what are the things that you want to see in your athletes? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a big question.
So that is a big question. So let's tackle your just general philosophies of how the club operates to start.
Okay, I think like my general philosophies are centered a lot around consistency, work ethic, and focus. And I say focus because I don't mean focus like every time anybody comes in here and trains, they're really serious. I mean focus on having specific intent with everything that you do. So our athletes definitely enjoy training, and they have friends that they train with, and it's always easier to stay dedicated to a program when you enjoy what you're doing. But they also understand that when they're here to train, they're here to work, and there's specific things that they need to be improving and developing and working on. So that's what I mean when I say focus. I think that just from a coaching philosophy in general, I think telling an athlete to focus is really pointless unless you have explained to them what they're trying to execute by giving them that cue. It's not going to go anywhere. I think anybody who's been unfocused at any time knows that you can't just tell somebody to focus and have it happen. So that focus is developed with conversations between myself and the athletes. So what are your training goals? What are we going to be accomplishing each day? You know, what are going to be your sort of mental cues when you get in the training space to make sure that you stay on task and stay involved? Consistency is really big for me, particularly in this sport. I think it took me a long time to realize that Olympic weightlifting is not actually about who lifts the heaviest weight. It's about who can lift the heaviest weight most of the time. It's really cool to lift heavy weights, and that's great, but we want to be able to produce predictable results at given points of the year throughout given competitions. And Jevin is actually a really good example of this. When he won his silver medal at Junior Nationals, he didn't have a PR in either lift, but he lifted exactly what he needed to on that day in order to secure that spot. And that's sort of a really great representation of what the sport is about. So he knew that his goal was bigger than trying to max out his snatcher or clean and jerk.
Right. So one of the major, I'm not going to say complaints, but questions I generally see you as an Olympic weightlifting coach get is the tendency for the training to focus a lot more on the like 50, 60, 70% threshold rather than heavy all the time, like the urgency to get heavy. What I generally observe, like people coming from the CrossFit environment, going into Olympic weightlifting environment, is there's a tendency to think when I Olympic weightlift, I just get to go for heavy snatch and
Right.
heavy clean and jerk all the time. That's why I want to do it. And then suddenly they're 6 months into a program and like, coach, I haven't maxed out in 6 months. Like, I don't know if I feel comfortable on this weight. So what would you say is the intent behind staying at the like moderate to lighter end of the spectrum? Is that fair? Like maybe
Yeah.
I'm missing what the program is, so correct me if I'm wrong. But like, what's the design behind those percentages, and why do we work in percentage work?
I think that comes down to sort of two things. One of them is that's a little bit of what I would refer to as a CrossFit syndrome, where the only exposure that athletes generally get of snatching clean and jerk is in a max lift.
Right.
Which, don't get me wrong, that's definitely a fun part of CrossFit and probably one of the reasons that I fell in love with weightlifting in the first place, but it's definitely not how you improve your sport. The other thing to sort of look at is, we talked a lot about this with the CrossFit programming chat as well, is that it all comes down to relative intensity. So if you were to come in and approach CrossFit with that same mentality, I'm going to max out my effort every day, I'm going to max out how long I can hang onto the bar, or I'm going to max out, I'm going to go until I throw up every single time. You're also not improving your training, and you're actually doing detriment to yourself. But with weightlifting in particular, those percentages, specifically like 60 to 75% ranges, are really important in developing practice under loads that do not require maximal output. So if you think about practicing or learning a new skill, you can't, your brain cannot execute the practice if it's trying at a maximal effort to execute the skill.
Right.
So we want to be in a weight range or a intensity level where you're able to practice multiple times without reaching fatigue, and not require maximal strength output.
Okay. Thea, I want to just pick your brain on this because I'm going to try to give you like maybe a multi-layered question here, and you can just sort of, just so we're not on the spot, you just kind of break down something that, or pick something that you sort of want to chat about. Like as an athlete who's had success in what would in the sport be a relatively short amount of time, and so you made a pretty significant jump just out of CrossFit into Olympic weightlifting, and then within, what was it, a couple of years?
Well, we should also mention that she was a very high-level collegiate
Right,
athlete
and I'm
as
not
well,
suggesting
in a
that's the
different
case.
sport.
In a different sport,
Yeah.
right? But you were a CrossFit athlete for a couple of years before you were like more, before we took Olympic weightlifting a little bit more seriously as a sport. So what would you have seen as the most significant change in training, either philosophies or even training styles in the Olympic weightlifting section versus the CrossFit section?
Definitely more, just like Amanda said, the intent behind everything.
Right.
I would come into CrossFit workouts and I don't really care how my pull-ups look or if everyone's the same or if how technically proficient they are.
Right.
I'm just gonna get through those. Whereas for weightlifting, literally every lift, you are so focused on everything and trying to make them all the same that it's way more of a mental effort than, for me at least, physically speaking.
To make the corrections?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people could just be like, if I just come in every day and do the work, and just hit the percentages, then I'm going to get better.
Yeah, and
right? But
recognizing that that's not
that's not
the
the
case. You can't just come in with no focus. If you're just doing snatches to check your snatches off,
Right.
you haven't improved anything. Even though you might have done your reps, you're probably not stronger because of them, and you might have just ingrained 5 more bad habits.
Right.
As opposed to moving your needle forward at all.
Okay, that's interesting.
If
And
that
again,
makes sense.
Yeah, it completely makes sense. And I think too, that's something that is important. Like you had asked me earlier about, just following a program online.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something, so those percentages, 60 to 70% range of your maximal load, you can definitely come in and complete the lifts, not miss lifts, check them off your program, and not accomplish the same practice routine that somebody else who's coming in who's mindful of what they're doing
Right.
and what they're trying to improve will. So that's something that's really important when you're looking at whether or not you want to train Olympic weightlifting, is working with a coach who can give you consistent, continuous feedback. And that will really make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. I know of many situations where people have followed an online program without maybe a coach in person giving feedback, and then got into a competition situation and been frustrated with the fact that they have not been able to PR their snatch or their clean and jerk. And again, that, can happen for a multitude of reasons, but the first thing I would look at is how mindful is your training?
Right.
How focused are you on practicing your craft and making it? One of the things that I hope gets across in this conversation is that CrossFit is really fun to follow the sport aspect of CrossFit, the games and local competitions, and that is all great. But CrossFit itself is a fitness methodology. So it's not a sport in the sense that you're practicing your execution to the same capacity that you need to for a specific sport. It would sort of be like me comparing, you guys are both volleyball athletes, so it would be me comparing your off-court training to translations on the field, right?
Right.
So you can definitely work over the summer or on the off season, get stronger, or build your explosive power so that you can jump more effectively. But unless you're practicing volleyball and doing drills specific to your sport, you are not going to see an improvement in that sport.
Right, okay.
And that's the same thing I think that comes down to Olympic weightlifting.
Design of the program and what is the intention of it, and then how does it vary closer to competitions? Ooh, it's
And
a big
why
one.
things are in the places.
Yeah.
The,
That they are.
the order.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just take
Alright.
care of that to start, and then we can chat about comp prep maybe after that. So let's just kind of talk about the program.
So, again, we're sort of assuming that people have a general knowledge of
What a
snatch and clean and jerk
is.
are.
Sure.
So I think if somebody, let's say somebody had been exposed to snatch and clean and jerk in CrossFit, and then they were looking to get involved in Olympic weightlifting, before we throw an overly complex program at them, they really need to be doing things that are going to practice the fundamentals of the lift. So that's your pulling position or your starting position, your receiving position, and then all the magic that happens in between. So depending on where people are most deficient in that overview, we would definitely tailor their programming to drills that work on improving those areas. Then we've gotten past that point where people are now able to perform relatively safe and well-executed snatch and clean and jerk. And now we're, again, going to continue improving them. So typically what my general template looks like is that they would do some sort of exercise that gets them ready for what I want them focused on in the session. Oftentimes this will be referred to as a priming exercise or a primer. What that would look like if somebody had trouble with their receiving position, I would have them do a receiving position drill, and that sort of hammers home what they should be focusing on in the session. Then they do some sort of exercise that's reinforcing the classic lift, and when we say classic lift, we're referring to snatch and clean and jerk, and not an accessory exercise. So that might be like a hang snatch or a power snatch or a full snatch variation. Then typically they would do some sort of strengthening exercise. So if they're on a day where we're focused on lower body strength, they'd be doing a squat variation. If we're on a day where we're focused on upper body strength, they'd be doing a press variation. And then accessory work from there is sort of an endless option. But again, your accessory work should be centered towards trying to fill in the holes for each athlete. So I'll use myself as an example. I struggle often with overhead strength and stability. So a lot of my accessory work has been upper body focused to make sure that that's less of a hole in my game.
Okay. Thea, so I'll have Thea point out her detriments as well as her strengths and how she feels that's
Planks.
probably being, yeah. So, yeah, like you've been in here talking about planks a bit as accessory work, but in your programming right now, what would you say is one of the primary focuses, and how would you as an athlete know that in the program?
Well, I know what kind of that is just talking to your coach.
Right.
There's no way I would know looking at that.
Right.
And that's kind of what Amanda does really well, is most of us at the gym have the same, do these lifts at this percentages, but we all have different things to think about during the lifts to benefit us individually.
Right.
Right now, I would still say it's like just pulling things off the ground.
Pulling things off. Yeah? Do you recognize that as well? As one
Yes.
Of the, yeah?
Thea is a unique athlete in the sense that her front squat is equivalent to her deadlift.
Yeah, that seems like an odd,
So,
odd dichotomy in power.
It's great.
Okay. Cool.
So even like after provincials, we did a huge time chunk of developing pulling strength, and even now that we're kind of more focused on competition, it still is like, that's my main focus, making sure I'm getting set off the floor, I'm pushing properly out of the right places, because I know that like the strength is there for everything else.
Okay. You're nodding in agreement?
yeah,
That
I
is
love
the
it.
focus?
Excellent.
Okay, well, let's...
We're learning things.
Sure, yeah, no, that's awesome. So let's take, I just want to take another athlete like Jevin. So Jevin is a tremendously technically strong lifter,
Right.
from my eye, and has had a lot of success because of it. So what are your focuses on an athlete like Jevin, somebody of his caliber?
Yeah, so,
And I don't mean to separate, because we have a lot of tremendous lifters in the gym, but I've had a lot of more exposure to Jevin,
Right.
because we've had him since he was, before he could drive a vehicle, so it's just popped.
we
in mind
also
if
know
is
that
here.
he won't mind us talking
Right,
about
then
it.
maybe there's the other thing too. So yeah, let's just focus on Jevin, but know that all of our lifters are tremendously valuable to us. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the biggest thing with Jevin, even from the beginning, because he came to us as a younger athlete, was continuing to make sure that his strength kept up with his technical proficiency. So he was he's always been a very smooth lifter from the beginning. So it was basically every time that he saw a strength improvement, he would see a PR in his snatch or clean and jerk. Now that he's getting a little bit older, he's starting to sort of reach that threshold where we now need to get a lot stronger before we're going to get past that barrier again. So he had a phenomenal performance at provincials this year. Same thing, as soon as we were finished provincials, we had a debrief. This is what we need to work on in order to continue moving forward. And his focus throughout the next several months was on building strength and applying that to his lifts.
Can you explain to me, a man of low IQ in few words, what periodization is? And then I'll see if we can sort of follow through with that. I'd also like to know if we have like a Chris Tuff's hat adjustment count, because the number, I noticed like last podcast, all I did was this, to this, to this, and like a second ago, I had it here and I wanted to adjust it so bad, and it was like
And that's
starting
all
to
you were
make
thinking.
all I was thinking about. Like you were making a lot of good points. It's like, fuck, I gotta move my hat so bad. Okay, sorry. Periodization, let's hit it.
Yeah, so periodization is the concept that you prioritize different things throughout the year, throughout the training cycle, and organize your deloading, which I think is another point that we want to hit on
Yeah,
as
for
well,
sure.
to make that appropriate. So when you look at for a lot of our athletes, our provincial championships, our local provincial competitions would be sort of what they would prioritize throughout the year.
Okay.
When you start to get to levels where you're competing nationally or eventually internationally, it's really important that you have sometimes up to a 4-year plan,
Right.
particularly when you look at athletes who are actually training to compete at events like the Olympics.
Right.
So in order for that to be effective, you have to be able to know what periods of time you're going to have to be working on strength development, because that's not going to be during times that you're trying to peak for competitions. You're going to need to know what times of the year you can actually give your athlete a rest, because you don't want them resting a few weeks before they need to be performing. And also making sure that you're allowing like the entire system to rest as well. So we're not just always hammering on leg strength all the time. There's ways that we sort of prioritize what we're focusing on in any given period of time.
Okay, so this is another big question, and it might just be a yes or no answer, but maybe a little insight would be better than none. You have junior, senior, and masters athletes.
Right.
And like, do you periodize or structure their programming different based on that? And like, don't like the idea of a master's athlete is sort of silly because our master's athletes are so fit. So it's not like they're any less capable. But when you lay down a program, are you considerate of those sort of age gaps or?
There's a couple things that you're most considerate about when you're looking at programming for somebody. One is athletic age.
Right.
So regardless of what age they are in real life, how long have they been doing the sport? That a lot of times people who will come into a weightlifting program will look at their program and they look at what the person next to them is doing, and they'll ask like, why aren't I doing that? And that's definitely one of the considerations. So volume, intensity, frequency, all that stuff differs between training age.
Okay.
Then there's also sort of the like stress of the athlete that you take into play, and I don't mean stress as in like I'm stressed out. I mean, you know, does that person have a physical job? Is that person going to do better training 4 days a week as opposed to 5 days a week because of how physical their job is? Or is this somebody who does shift work and they're going to have programming requirements around how often they can train, things
Right.
like that. As well as the training goals of that person. So somebody who has high performance goals is probably their program is probably going to look a little bit different than somebody who's just training for personal development.
So,
Does that answer your question?
yeah, it does. I think that's excellent. I just want to, before we move into like deload and peak, Thea, can you just talk a little bit about the frequency of your training, and maybe just a little bit of self-reflection on dealing with stressors and what it feels like to, if there's different levels of fatigue and how that affects your game plan, and if sort of like deload versus peak versus competition versus all of these different types of sort of periodized results, if you notice a change in the programming or like what are you seeing just from your ground level? Let's just like condense it down like the last 6 months. Like what has that looked like for
Yeah.
you, right?
So, leading up to provincials, we had our focus was snatch and clean jerk. So we would have lots of singles, some doubles, and then like build to heavy singles for the day. And that
Okay.
was like weeks of
How
that.
far out would that have been prior to provincials that you would have, maybe this would be a better way to frame it. Out for Thea, how far out of provincials would you have started to peak for that?
So like,
Specifically.
generally, you want to be like entering a preparatory style program.
Right.
At least 8 weeks out from a major competition.
Right.
Like what we learned from, I know I'm sort of going all over the place,
No, it's
but
okay.
what we learned from doing that cycle with Thea is that she responds very well, and this actually happens a lot with female athletes, but she responds really well to consistent touches on heavier loads.
Okay.
So not maximal loads, right?
Right.
Not, she wasn't PRing, well, you kind of were at the end, PRing every day, but
Yeah.
she wasn't maxing out intentionally every day.
But I was like able to go up to 90% with no misses
Right.
for weeks.
Right.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
what we've done now in prep for her national competition is actually start that cycle a little bit earlier. Again, working within how her body is responding, making sure that she's allowed to have continual exposure to those weights in a controlled environment, so that she's confident when she steps on the platform that she's able to produce the results.
Okay.
And that was like 3 to 4, that was 3 days a week
Okay.
before provincials.
Before provincials.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk about immediately following provincials. What would happen then?
We went into volume.
Okay.
So
Was that
lots.
like just the day after? Was there any time off? Do you remember?
Took like a week
A
off.
week?
I still came in and did CrossFit.
Okay.
But didn't lift for a week. And then came in and it was right to volume. So high number of reps, relatively low weight, and then so many squats. Just all
All the
the
squats,
time. And that
right.
was, we went up to 4 days a week
Okay.
then.
All right. How was that transition from 3 to 4? Was that challenging
It
or
was,
was that reasonable?
yeah, no, it was, I definitely noticed it for sure.
Right.
And I would kind of do like 3 days in a row of lifting, and then I would have a rest day, and then one more day.
Right.
And by that third day, you're definitely,
Smoked.
yeah,
Yeah.
and more, like, my body would do okay, but kind of like your head is a little tired at that point. But it's definitely an adjustment too. And when you start lifting heavier things, you start training with heavier training weights,
Right.
which also made a really big
Yeah.
impact the
There's
first
the
little
downfall
bit
of
too.
PRing.
Yes.
All your percentages
Yeah,
come with it.
and it was like a big adjustment too, because like Amanda says, like, you consistently lifting those
Right.
wasn't something I was used to. It's easy to lift something heavy one time,
Right.
but I couldn't lift the moderately heavy many times
Right. Okay.
for a little bit.
So how long were we in that 4-day-a-week cycle? Do you remember?
She's
Before-
still in it.
Oh,
We're
we're
still
still
there.
in 4 days?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. How many days a week is Jevin in Olympic weightlifting? Is he 5?
So Jevin trains 5 days a week.
Jevin trains 5 days a week?
Thea is unique in the sense that she is a dual athlete, so
Right.
she trains consistently in CrossFit as well. That dual training requires a lot of thought and prioritization, I'll
Right.
say. So that style is not for everybody. We have a couple fabulous masters athletes that are also able to do the same thing. But when it's not always what will work best for the athlete. So
Right.
for in Jevin's situation, for instance, he does best when he's training his sport 5 days a week.
So with all that in mind, can you talk to us about the idea of progressive overload and deload and how those things fit into programming? Yeah, hit it.
So one of the great questions that we had was asking to sort of chat about what the concept was around a deload week.
Right.
And that came from Angelina, who recently started weightlifting training, and she was going through one of her first deload cycles, and she wanted to know sort of why we did that. So when you look at philosophies behind strength training, the progressive overload is the idea where we are continually stressing the body to create adaptation or create change. But that obviously has an end point. So if you just always tried to stress your body to create a reaction, eventually you would hit an area where you were overtraining or actually like burning out.
Right.
So what we do to prevent against that is
He'll stop.
is oh, that's okay. Sorry. What we do
to prevent against it.
yeah, what we do to prevent against that overtraining syndrome is go through periodic deloads. So what that looks like is you're still training, you're still doing your lifts, but we reduce either the volume or the intensity, or sometimes both. And oftentimes as well, to sort of touch on that mental aspect as well, oftentimes it's also reducing that level of focus or intent, in the sense that there's not as much pressure on the athlete for that week.
Right.
So that doesn't mean that you come in and you start moving sloppy,
Correct.
but it means that you allow yourself to take a little bit of a step back, reflect on maybe some things that have improved in that training cycle, focus on what you want to improve on the next training cycle, and also just give your body a chance to rest
Right.
and recoup. Everybody, so that concept, progressive overload and deloading, and just training in general, it's really important to remember that every athlete reacts differently. So some athletes will go through that cycle frequently. They'll go through like a deload every couple of weeks.
Okay.
Some athletes will train for a longer period of time before they have to sort of back off. And some of those differences are evident between men and women, younger and older, different things like that.
So you're attuned to that as a coach, that I may want to put a deload week in the next 3 or 4 weeks with an athlete if you're starting to see some general fatigue or lack of intent. Is that the idea?
Yeah, so we typically, like Thea said, everybody, when you run a club, it's a lot harder to dial those specific things into each athlete.
Right.
So what I really try to foster is an open dialogue between them and me.
Right.
So we definitely have scheduled deloads. We have a program template that follows that method. But if somebody is feeling like, for whatever reason, they're feeling really beat up, or they're feeling like they're not producing the results that they want to be, we can have a chat and we can quickly modify the program to reflect that.
Okay.
So sometimes, very rarely does that ever result in days off of training. Most of the time it's about adjusting those volumes or intensities to make sure that that person is able to cope
Right.
and deal.
Okay, cool. I guess it was always really interesting to me, before we move on, maybe to our final few points, is that, and maybe this is kind of worth mentioning, but the word intensity in Olympic weightlifting versus CrossFit is very different, but maybe relevant. Intensity in weightlifting is generally regarded as weight, is it not?
Yep.
Yeah, so
well,
I feel like that's just a very so the first time I heard that, where somebody said, we're increasing the intensity, and by which you meant we're increasing the load for today, is just an interesting maybe insight into how you should look at Olympic weightlifting, where imagine 100% intensity all the time through an hour to an hour and a half session,
Oh,
and
it-
how unproductive that would be as an Olympic weightlifter.
For sure.
And that might be something that people generally carry from CrossFit, is that 100% intensity where they want to max out all the time, and how unproductive that is in an Olympic weightlifting setting. Is that
yeah,
fair?
and I think like Thea can definitely offer some insight here as well, but I know myself as well from an athletic perspective. When I first started training Olympic weightlifting, I thought more is always better.
Right.
So I wanted to do more reps, I wanted to lift more weights, I wanted to work harder, and that was how I was expressing it. And realistically, after going through several speed bumps involving an injury, not related to that training, I realized that I have, because I can't physically work at 100% intensity, I've really had to dial in my mental game.
Right.
And I do perform every set with as close to 100% focus as I possibly can. And what I'm trying to do is maximize the productivity of every single set and rep that I do in training. And that's because I've had to work around that speed bump.
Right.
However, I've learned so much through that process in how I apply it to my athletes and making sure that every rep that they do counts for something. So there's no more sort of garbage reps or wasted reps. You have to find a way to take something from each one of those, because you can't abuse your body in that sense of wasting those repetitions
Right.
over and over again.
And I think I want to just, and maybe you can touch on it and we can just chat about it, but you can, frequently it comes off, or it's maybe often regarded that Amanda's the mean coach when it comes to Olympic weightlifting, right?
That's all right.
Yeah, which is great. Like, I think it's important that you're executing or expecting consistencies and boundaries in how your athletes perform. But there is something vital about how athletes treat their sessions, and you see that very clearly. So what is, how do I want to frame that? Just give me a minute. Why do you think it's important for athletes to take each session so seriously and focus? And why do you get after athletes when they're unfocused? Like, I know that sounds obvious when the question's posed, but like, so these people are here, many of our athletes, 4 to 5 times a week, and there's an hour there where it's just not about having fun, it's about working really hard. But there's a reason to that, right? And I just like, maybe you can expound on that a little bit. You may have already touched on it a lot, but maybe if you were to hammer it home, what would your direct philosophy with focus, intention versus fun and enjoying the sport? Like, there's obviously a line there where you should be enjoying it, but it's also not always fun, right? Does
Yeah.
that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
this is hard, particularly for athletes that just Olympic weightlift, because that is that's a real grind that a lot of people may not appreciate, how hard it is to come in there almost in solitude and focus on that
Right.
hour to an hour and a half session every
Yeah.
day at the same movements, the same percentages, right? So, yeah, sort of your value in terms of like fun versus focus versus happiness versus success versus like how, there's a lot there. Where would you prioritize? Where's your hierarchy?
Well, I think that again, like I said, grew organically from my own experience with injury.
Right.
And really realizing that when I first started Olympic weightlifting training, I was convinced that I was invincible, and that as long as you moved all right, you were never going to get injured, and that your time with the sport is infinite, and
Right.
as long as you worked hard enough, you could accomplish what you wanted to accomplish. And that mindset has certainly changed for me. So what I hope for our athletes is that they grow to respect their capabilities and their potential, and find a way to approach that in a grateful manner every single day. So, coming in without focus and just sort of messing around in the training space, one, does yourself a number of disservices because you're not progressing at the rate or the ability that you could. It also greatly affects everyone around you. So I feel that one of my biggest responsibilities as the head coach of the Hubtown Weightlifting Club is to ensure that training space and the atmosphere in that training space remains productive for everyone. So if that means that occasionally I have to come off as the mean coach, that's fine. I know deep down that I'm not actually as mean as you guys all think I am,
Right.
but it's important for me that that standard is upheld first and foremost. And I think that realizing that every day that, I know this sounds really cheesy, but every day that you get to participate in the sport is genuinely a gift, and knowing that you certainly can accomplish anything that you want as long as you approach it in the right ways. I truly believe that, but knowing that you should never take anything for granted. Your time in sport is not indefinite or infinite, and that your potential will only carry you so far.
Right. I would love to end that there, but I do have another question for Thea.
Well,
just
I also wanted, maybe Thea could talk about going from a team
I
sport.
was literally just gonna ask that, so we're on the same page, and maybe we can end on that.
Yeah.
So, I wanna look at it like, you were a tremendously successful volleyball player and a very strong volleyball player in a team, specific sport. The Hubtown Weightlifting Club still likes to establish itself as a team of Olympic weightlifting athletes, but what were the major changes you had to make in how you train between volleyball and Olympic weightlifting?
This is gonna sound like so obvious, but like it's really just all on you. In team sports, you can kind of get away with the mentality that like, well, I'm probably doing my best, and like it's everyone else's problem when things go poorly.
Right.
And like, there's nothing left for me to fix, because it doesn't matter what I do or how well I do it. If my team can't keep up, I can't succeed.
Right.
So like you kind of start to fall into that mindset a little bit. But when you're weightlifting, like it's literally all you.
Yeah.
If you aren't perfect and start to like refine your technique and think about how you have to constantly be improving, you won't. Where in team sports, you can only be as good as your team.
Right.
And I was not used to that sort of responsibility before.
Okay, so, I mean, is it fair to say that your darkest hours generally exist in an Olympic weightlifting area because it's just you and the bar and you're
Yes.
losing?
100%. And we do, like, we're really lucky here in this space that everyone is doing the same things, and so a lot of the times you can like commiserate together
Right.
with your teammates, but it's so hard on the head, because if you don't make your lifts happen, it's just because you aren't making your
Right.
lifts happen,
So-
and you have to find ways to get
Right,
out of that.
so what are your current strategies? Because like, we're less in a team environment where other people can sort of step up and like, I'm gonna help lift the weight with you, right? That
Yeah.
would be the sort of the volleyball mentality,
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
hey, you're having a rough game, I got you.
Yep.
What strategies have you started to implement? If you have any right now, like we might still be in a growing process, but are there
Yeah.
any specific strategies that you feel like you've had to take on or sort of started to develop in Olympic weightlifting?
We're still definitely like work in progress
Right.
for that, but a big one that's helped a lot, and we've talked a lot about it, is like visualizing and just like, you know how good lifts should feel, and so just take a minute, think about the feeling of it, instead of like, point 1 is this one, check mark 2 is doing this,
Right.
whereas that kind of like starts to snowball
Totally.
into bad things if I'm not able to do all of that. But like, I know how a good snatch should feel, and that's what I need to think about
Cool.
for that.
So I think.
Thea is a unique athlete in the sense that she is also a coach. So it's very easy for her to become overcritical
Right.
beyond what a typical athlete only might process. So it's important for her to recognize what she can change and what she can't change right now,
Okay.
and sort of let go of that stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah, so.
So let's leave it there. I think that opens us up in the future to talk a little bit more maybe about mental strategies in CrossFit and Olympic weightlifting. Knowing that we are still growing and how we develop our strategies as athletes and coaches. And I hope everybody enjoyed the chat today. We were very long-winded, so this is long, and it may not all apply, but for those of you that want to know what's happening in Olympic weightlifting,
Ask more
that's
questions.
yeah, and that's a great start. So,
Comments below.
yeah, if you don't want to, yeah, and if you don't feel comfortable making just a comment below, or something comes to mind in class, just say, hey, I'd love to know about this, and we will happily tackle it. So thank you very much, guys. Have a great day.
Yay!